you very much for having us, and thank you very much, Anna, for also taking part in this. So, Anna, can you just start with a few words about yourself and your experience? I'd be happy.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Anna Wetter, and I am Head of Policy Design at PDR, which is a design and research centre at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I've been working in the space of service design and policy design for more than 10 years, both in research, but also in practice, setting up policy labs in UK government.
Perfect, thank you. And you have been really been involved in this area since its very beginning, been part of a really large EU project as well and covering this area. So it's an amazing opportunity to have you here today and to discuss these topics. And I'm, as Kalle described, a design researcher and associate professor, have been working with service design predominantly for the past 10-15 years, and then of course with the lately an increasing interest in design and policy design in public sector and what it means for this, both the design profession per se, but as well what happens within public sectors when we start to involve designerly approaches in other processes. We are thinking today, we have a little bit more than an hour together, that we first do a little brief introduction to the topic area, and then we'll do kind of 3 rounds where we discuss first where Anna presents the kind of some thoughts and the area or the topic, and then we have a short conversation, and we also open up for questions meanwhile. And we've asked Jonas and Kalle to be kind of charge of the chat. So if they can pick up questions there and feed into the conversation. And we hope to have time for a short break for either just taking a screen break or chatting, whatever you'd like a bit in this seminar. So welcome once again, and we'll now go in for the first part of this. And I think you're probably very well aware of this ongoing transformation that everybody is talking about. We need to move from what you could say the old system, or you can call them NPM systems, or whatever kind of product or production oriented systems that tend to be reactive and standardized and centralized, and everything is like more of the same kind of idea, towards a more future system that is supposed to be, and we want them to be, preventive and personalized, decentralized, work with continuous flows rather than fragmentation, to be human oriented rather than producer focused, and focus on value and value creation rather than volume and money per se. And as I guess you that take part in this seminar are well aware of, that design-driven approaches has been proposed to really help this transformation, to propose vision-oriented ways of working, bring in the citizens, the human-centeredness, to actually work in a very concrete networked ways of doing this through new alliances and being systems-oriented, but also rather focus on the impact, what's actually going to happen out there, rather than the internal processes. And also a capacity to embrace complexity through different ways of working, through bringing in the senses, through the aesthetic competence, rather than just focusing on numbers or efficiency. In Sweden, we saw the first picture of lots of labs over the world, and Anna has done a huge work on the lab structure in the UK, and that's a lot of that you will draw on today in your presentation. And just for the backdrop, and I see that design lab infrastructure in Sweden heading has dropped a bit, but in the lab infrastructure in Sweden, in a study that we did in 2019, with a purpose to understand to what extent, why do we in Sweden don't have a lab on a governmental level, which they have, like UK have, Denmark had with MindLab, but it has been transformed, Finland and others have had so for long. And we see that it has to do with several things, amongst other that we have another governance model, but we also discovered that we have a broad set of design labs within sectorial spaces. I'm sorry, Anna, an international guest, that this is in Swedish, but there are a set of sectorial labs that has, like in healthcare or built environment, for example, or other that works on regional levels, that is more in a municipality or a specific region or a city. So our infrastructure of labs has become slightly different. But what is interesting still is that we have, if you talk the micro level, if you work with the citizens or in a municipality or a local context or on an organizational level, it's quite dense, but we still lack this overarching system or actor that has a designer approaches on a state governance level. So I think this is also interesting to discuss later during today, how we could potentially work with that question, or if there's a need of one in relation to the UK system in that sense. When we have then had this big promise of design as an ongoing force for the ongoing transformation, and this is happening, and we are introducing design approaches in broad terms, there is also some research that start to talk about that, does design hold for this promise? Can we actually deliver what has been told? What are the limitations of design? And we've seen also a vast amount of design labs that have started, but after some years, they have disappeared for various reasons. It could be the argument that now we have reached our purpose because the approaches are known, or it can just actually be simple reasons that the person that was supporting this initiative changed positions and the support is no longer there, which hints us to the lack of structural support for this kind of design approaches over long term. And there are other reasons as well, but it's an interesting, when you introduce designerly approaches into a big system that's not used to this more organic ways of working, there's also a risk of difficulties that will appear on various levels. And that's also one of the reasons it's important to discuss the designerly skills and how are we working to get into this. And lastly but not least, maybe just like short, when we talk about the policy design, that's more about the kind of regular policy development process that's ongoing. Design for policy, as we talk about it here, is the use of design in government, but of course government can also be national, but also local or regional. And design in policy is use of design in enterprises or wider societies where we design or maybe work with the implementation of policies already there. So this was a broad overview or kind of introduction to this area and the premises for today. And now I lend the word to you, Anna.
Great, thank you. If you could, Katarina, please click through the next two slides. So I'm going to give a quick overview of lessons from UK labs. As we know, for example, from Nesta, there are more than 100 of these labs around the world in government. From a mapping that was done by the European Commission a few years ago, there are approximately sort of 60 in Europe, although, as Katarina says, these numbers do fluctuate as labs sort of come and go. I did an extensive study in the summer about UK labs and where they are operating. And what's quite fascinating, and it's probably very different to the Swedish context, is that in the UK, we used to have a lot of local level labs, but actually many of those have shut in recent years. And actually the activity of labs and use of design for policy is very much concentrated in national government, but also in our devolved nations as well. So we have labs in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And interestingly, I'd really highlight the Northern Ireland Innovation Lab as a really great example of a regional lab. They were established at the same time as Policy Lab, which is often seen as the archetype in the UK, which used to be based in our Cabinet Office. So at the moment, there are around 10 labs at national level in the UK, and I helped to set up the lab in our tax office, which is HMRC Policy Lab. I'm very excited because I'm currently working with the Foreign Office to establish their lab. And what's interesting about their lab is that their lab is not only London-based, but working across other embassies around the world that the UK government has, including, for example, Singapore. Katarina, I don't know if you want to click onto the next slide, please.
There you go.
Great, thanks. I hope you can see this. I really like this image. It is dating back from 2016, but it looks at the government innovation hype cycle, and particularly where design features on this hype cycle and where labs features on this hype cycle. So you should be able to see that at the time, design thinking was just about to descend this peak of inflated expectation down into this trough of disillusionment, and the same with policy labs. And what I'm really curious about is this cycle of policy labs, and whether actually now, a few years on, have policy labs reached this slope of enlightenment, or are they still in this trough of disillusionment? So I think this very much speaks to our sort of friend or foe theme today. And I'd be really, really curious to hear your perspectives on this. And I think that it's different in different countries. So I think at the moment in the UK, the labs wave is certainly riding high, as I said, in national government, but not at a local level. So if you could click on the next slide, please. And I've done some work around creating a model to look at policy labs. And this is about not only things that policymakers should consider when establishing policy labs, but also things that existing labs might want to think about when monitoring or evaluating their labs. So there's kind of 4 parts to this model: proposition, product, people, process. So what is the proposition of the lab? What's the vision? What are the governance structures? Does the lab charge for its services? Interestingly, in the UK, we have a number of labs which do charge for their services. You charge internally across their government department for services. And there are labs which offer their services internally for free. Metrics of success. Should we be prescribing KPIs to labs? Because to me, that really kind of makes us fit more into the more traditional approaches to government box, rather than thinking about how can we assess value differently. Then in terms of product, what is the offer to their colleagues in government? So for example, what are the user needs they're trying to address? Do they have a set of bespoke services, or are they a kind of off-the-shelf menu of services? Do they do training as well as intervention? Thinking about people, what's quite interesting with these labs is that very often they start off with external consultants, as in external design agencies providing the intervention, while they slowly build an in-house capability. So that's very much the case, for example, with the Foreign Office that I'm working with at the moment. They had a lab that was manned by external consultants for a number of years, and now they're bringing that expertise in-house to build their own data, digital and technology capability. What methods will the labs use? So it's not just about design, perhaps it's also about behavioral insights, ethnography, big data, etc. What's the kind of the menu of methods in operation? And then thinking about process and ways of working. So is there a clear user journey for a policymaker wanting to engage with the lab? What are the selection criteria for projects? So I think sometimes policy labs are so keen to work with any project that comes along that maybe they don't think about necessarily focusing on some of those more transformational or large-scale demonstrator projects that really can build their credibility and legitimacy. So I've been working to develop selection criteria. And then also promotion, how do you build capacity, or how do you raise awareness of these approaches across the department and across other government departments as well? So we have a network of UK labs in government, for example, and some of them communicate with the public through a blog and external engagement, and some of them very much operate behind closed doors. So yeah, Katarina, if you could click onto the next slide, please. And I think now
there's a question in the chat here just about this picture, and the question is: the users are not mentioned in this image. Are they part of it? Maybe in people?
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the user needs that the labs are trying to address? Because I think sometimes the labs, I think, need to sort of practice what they preach. And things change, and as we know, a very fast-paced environment. So actually, I think labs should revisit, what user needs they're trying to address on a regular basis.
Perfect, thank you.
If you want to know more about that, I've actually just, I'm doing a little shameless self-promotion. I had a journal article published yesterday, which I've just put in the chat.
Perfect. I had a quick glance on it. It seems really interesting, that article, and just, as you say, flesh out this framework and also discuss different financing models and what's good or how we could approach that. And I think that actually fits very well with the topic here. Also, if we some few questions for discussion, and as you said, have the labs reached a slope of enlightenment? I think that's an interesting question also in the terms of it's, if you've seen the movement from, it was UK was really early in establishing, also with the design council's support in the early 2000s, of small labs that really were pioneering these fields. And then you see this is kind of, those are closing down and moving up rather on a more national level. What would you say, why, what's happening then on the regional level then? Can you say anything about that? Or local level?
Absolutely. So I was just reading the questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely different flavors. And I think it's really fascinating how in Sweden you have these sectoral labs. So we don't, for example, have sectoral labs. And I think actually that's a really fascinating model. And I think what's also interesting is that there's a lot of healthy competition between the devolved nations at regional level in the UK. Right. But I do think it's really fascinating that all of them, through different processes, have recognised the need for these labs. And just to pick up on one of the questions in the chat, when I talk about a lab, I'm talking about a multidisciplinary team that uses a range of different innovation methods, which could also be design, to involve citizens and stakeholders in a meaningful way in that public policy or public service development process. And just to be clear, there are not all labs are of course policy labs. There are a number of labs in the UK which very much operate in that service design space and that digital innovation space. But I think it's really important to recognise that very often you can't change so you can't change public services unless you influence the way that policy is made and ensure that the policy process is joined up. So I hope that sort of answers some of the questions in the chat.
Do you think then, your question on the lab, if the labs have reached the slope of enlightenment, what's your position on that?
It's really fascinating. So, for example, the EU lab, EU policy lab, has gone from strength to strength, and it's now quite a significant initiative. But what's also fascinating is that some of the early labs, like Mind Lab, and as you said, Helsinki Design Lab, have either closed their doors or evolved considerably. So this kind of, I'm not going to call it a boom bust cycle, but this kind of, as I said, this life cycle of peaks and troughs of labs, I find really fascinating. So as I said, in the UK, I think this is something that is still very valued. But for example, some labs are very associated with strong leadership. So I'm sure many of you are aware of Andrea Siodmak, who used to lead Policy Lab in the Cabinet Office. And of course, when a really significant figure moves, there's always a risk, that the lab, due to changing political priorities or changing funding structures, might disappear. What's interesting in the case of Policy Lab, which is one of the first ones in the UK, is that it's now made the move from being in the Cabinet Office, which is very close to the Prime Minister's office and quite central in government, to the Department for Education. On the surface, this might look like moving it more towards the periphery until you find out that the UK policy profession is currently based in the Department for Education. So Policy Lab was keen to align themselves more closely with the policy profession and to influence the way that civil servants learn about the policy process and to infuse design within the policy profession.
That's interesting. As you see, where do you localize? Where do you put the competence? Might be easier to say. Yeah. Where to get it close to where it's actually carried out. We had a discussion yesterday in our SVID, or comparison to maybe design council, also about the lab structures and how do we then influence policy. And someone said that you need to be where the track changes are in the document where policy is being written.
I like that.
So I think that's an interesting take on where do we need to be to actually be able to influence what policy actually is set there, because in the end, at least policy in terms of legislation will be written documents. Then policy in terms of how they are carried out, culture, etc., you can influence in other ways throughout in the organizations, etc. Have you seen an increase, since over the years now also, we are discussing a lot the difference, or maybe not the labs as a fixed structure, say that you have this lab that has an organization versus having distributed design competence in organizations that might have started out as a lab or think of them as self, but then they kind of, as you say, changes in leadership, maybe then makes it more possible that all of a sudden you're employed in a specific unit and then carry out your work more in the line, so to speak. Have you just a similar development in the UK, or can you say anything about your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating point. How do you build capability, capacity across the organization for policy design? So obviously that expertise tends to be initially concentrated in the labs. And very often what you find is that, for example, policymakers might come on secondment into the lab, and also people in the lab tend to circulate and sometimes move out of the lab into the wider organization. And then you often have quite a systematic program of upskilling, through capacity building, mentoring, training, secondments, etc., to try to create those other pockets of expertise across the department outside the lab. And this is really crucial for the sustainability, of the approaches. And I think that certainly there are departments in UK government that have done that better than others. So, for example, I think Ministry of Justice would be a really great example. They have sort of created pockets of this design for policy expertise outside the lab. And it's almost like a hub and spoke model. So you have a series of champions and advocates who then start to build capacity for those approaches in their own organizations. I noticed Sabina's got a question. Hi,
yes,
Sabina.
Should we let her in? Yes, hi, Sabina. Nice to have you here.
Well, hi, thanks so much for this good morning session, but because it's such a good morning session, and it's like in the worst of times, I'm on the middle of the road, I'm shopping and I'm preparing my conference. So please forgive me if I missed actually partially some things, but first of all, I want to add to Katarina, the last number of government innovation labs was 600. So, and that has changed already from like a year and a half ago where it was 500. So of course, what we see here is apples, pears, sausages, and a couple of beans. I mean, so whatever an innovation lab is, we don't quite know anyways, right? That's the one thing. The other thing that really made me curious was Anna's slide, where she has these 4 people, product, process. What's the first? No, people, product, process, products, of course. And you're probably familiar with Camille Michlewski's work on design attitude. And when you look at design attitude and the characteristics of a designer, you can almost map the characteristics of a designer that Michlewski identifies to your model of the innovation lab, which is really interesting actually, because it points yet again to the centrality of design in these kind of environments and the kinds of skills that are applying. So this is, I thought, an interesting reminder, to give it a little bit more depth in terms of the grounding in design. And then I had a last thought, with your comments on what I heard, and I must say I literally got kicked out at some point. But what I heard was that you gave a lot of power to the innovation labs. And there is a lot that these people in the innovation labs can do. And there are many ways that they can influence and steer, as the Helsinki Design Lab said, steward, the kind of path that they can take. However, I just worked with colleagues in public management and organization studies on a paper where we looked at the structural, the implications, for example, of a principal agent model from public management, where it matters how a lab is even set up. Does it have one owner? Does it have many owners? If you look at these different labs that have closed, for example, Citra, I mean, like the Helsinki.
Sabine,
yeah.
Please, if you can let Katarina and Anna go on. If you have any specific question, could you please?
Yeah, right. Okay. You made me think. This is good. And like I said, I'm in the middle of a morning walk. I'll shut up. I'll let them talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Thank you for your reflections.
We'll call later.
Yes, let's catch up. We have a few other questions in the chat that we might address that might be more directed questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the question someone's asked about whether policy labs are a performance space rather than a production space. And I'd like to challenge this. Because although a conventional innovation lab or a digital lab might have more tangible outputs, like a public service, actually, the tangible output from a policy lab should be, for example, a more creative public consultation process, or a more citizen-focused policy framework or set of policy guidelines. So I actually think that very often policy labs are less of a performance space than other labs, because the application of design to policy is still relatively new. And so people don't necessarily want to do this in a very public space. So I actually think that policy labs operate more behind closed doors than other labs do. It's not like a living lab, which tend to be very open. They are, I would say, very different. And I would say that the outcomes from a policy lab are no less tangible than for a lab focusing on digital public services, for example. But I love the question.
I was also reflecting on, of course, the labs that we've seen on the different maps, and if I have different characteristics, different aims, purposes, and competences. But it also oftentimes you have the between innovation labs and policy labs, and saying they pretty much more of the same or a similar approach. But I agree with you that you're touching on that the policy labs might need a more safe space and a space that, of course, we want more creative or innovative ways for people, but that might not be the purpose. It's the better ways, the inclusion, the change of perspective in the policies that I think that the policy labs are after. As a consequence of that, innovations may occur in the ways that these policies needs to be put into practice. But that might not be the purpose per se, to have innovation or innovative public sector. It's to have in my opinion, at least, it's having a public sector that better meets the needs of the citizens and our society. And then it becomes part of a longer transformation rather than a specific innovative purpose. But that can just be the beef I have in my head between innovation and transformation. So. Yeah.
I think that's a really helpful insight, and I'm really delighted. There's so many questions in the chat. There's really some really great questions coming out. So
but we can do like this, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Anna.
No. How do you want to run it? Do you want me to address the questions, or do you want to go on to the next section?
I think that we've said also for prior seminars that there have been a lot of overwhelmed of questions. We can also address them, Anna and I, after the seminar, and kind of post a Q&A kind of thingy, or another format for this too, so they won't get lost, because I think there are some really interesting questions there. But let's move on to the next topic, so we kind of covered over it. I thank you for being so engaged and feeding in here. So now we kind of moving from the labs part to the trends, what we see in the policy design trends.
Yeah, so one of the questions I get very often asked by policymakers is, well, why should I take a design approach to developing policy? So this is actually some research I did over the summer about understanding, based on the input from various policy labs, what those kind of drivers are. So there's a number of different themes here, and I'm going to touch on them. So the changing nature of evidence. I think traditionally, policy making has been very much driven by quantitative statistics and big data, excuse me. But actually now, the nature of evidence required for policy making is changing. So this is all about, from my side, humanizing the numbers. So it's the difference between that kind of helicopter view and then deep diving into the data and understanding what that data means and what the lived experiences are for people who are those policy beneficiaries. I think there's also a trend in UK government around more user-centred approaches. So this has very much been started thanks to the Government Digital Service, and they've brought design approaches to the way that we deliver digital public services. So I would say that there would be relatively, there's very good awareness in UK government among civil servants of Government Digital Service and what design can bring to digital public services. But the awareness of what design could bring to policy is changing. However, when you understand the principles of service design, then you cannot, as a civil servant with no background in design, you can begin to extrapolate where design might be able to add value to policy. So there is a growing interest in these more user-centered approaches and the recognition that traditional policy processes are not necessarily the most effective and need to change. So I think that's a really positive development. Another development is end-to-end policymaking. So previously in the UK, policymaking has been very siloed. This is a little bit flippant and obviously very simplified, but you might be familiar with the concept of the minister waking up in the middle of the night with a new idea, which then gets handed to a policy team who has to retrofit this policy idea based on some data they've come across. That gets handed to a programming and budgetary team. That then gets handed to a digital public services team. Firstly, the public has barely been involved in this process in an active way. And by the time this policy concept has reached, the service implementation team, it's the kind of policy intent has often been lost, but also the context, has been potentially morphed as well. So it ends up, you end up investing a lot more time in understanding what the policy context is, and it is a very resource intensive process. And government is recognising this now, and they have recognised they need more joined up policy making, so that the delivery bodies need to be more involved early in the policy process, but also policymakers need more accountability for what happens further down the line. So I think that's a really positive development in government as well. More meaningful public consultation. So public consultation used to be very much a tick box exercise in the UK, something that was mandatory and wasn't necessarily done in a very engaging way. But now civil servants are experimenting with gamification for public consultation. Imagine if you were Minister of Transport for the day, and you have all these things you could spend money on. Where would you invest the budget, for transport, for example? So these are all examples of more creative public consultation, which I think is also very exciting. And then the need for rapid policy prototyping. So if anything, COVID has demonstrated how quickly governments need to be able to make decisions and to test, policy concepts live in the field. And that's what designers do all the time. You iteratively test a prototype and get user feedback. And I think that's, how, we can make parallels between the policy process and the design process, this need for rapid policy prototyping. And then the rise of future thinking. So futures has become, a really great driver for thinking about things in a broader sense, but also in a more speculative sense. So more specialist design approaches have come into the policy domain, like speculative design. So the UK government actually has, I think last year or 2 years ago, had the first official job title, first job description for a speculative designer in a policy lab, which is really exciting. There's still only one of them, but that's a good start. So next slide.
That's interesting. Really nice to see that those approaches are being embraced as well, surely.
Yeah.
Slowly but surely, maybe.
Yeah, slowly but getting there. Yeah, it's exciting. And then I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but just as I'm sure it's the same in Sweden, they're shifting power dynamics more towards the citizen. So the difference between developing policy for citizens and developing policy with citizens. If you want to click onto the next slide. And this slide alludes to, as I said, the difference between qualitative and quantitative insight for policymaking. So traditionally, big data and statistical evidence has been used for evidence-based policymaking. But now that's being supplemented or complemented by different forms of evidence, including what you might call thick data, or user insights that we gather from conducting user research and design research. And so it's so now you're sort of seeing, as I said, this helicopter view being complemented by this kind of deep dive insight, which I think is also a really positive move. So if you want to click onto the next slide. So this is, sorry, I mentioned this already. This is about speculative design in government. So how you can use different frames to push the boundaries of policy development and the concepts of policy making. So again, something that's relatively only been introduced in the last couple of years. So if you click onto the next slide. So I'm really curious. I'd love to know, the thoughts of other participants about whether we need a chief design officer in UK government to lead that leadership piece, because I think that top level leadership in design is missing. I think the policy labs have been very successful, and there was a question in the chat about what do the networks of policy labs contribute. Well, for example, the networks of labs share job descriptions for designers, like speculative designers or policy designers or user researchers. We look at how we can make the transition from using expensive external consultants to building an in-house capability. And what's interesting is that we've never had that top level leadership in design in UK government. For example, there are a number of cities that have or used to have chief design officers. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Helsinki, and Anne Stenros used to be chief design officer. I don't know what happened there, but it's interesting to see, how these roles come and go. And I know in Eindhoven as well, they had a chief design officer. So I think chief design officer at a city level is a really fantastic idea. And can we kind of upscale that, and can we have a chief design officer for government, national or devolved governments? And then kind of more general question about how we can advance this design for policy agenda. So really curious to hear your thoughts, Katarina.
Yes, and I think this chief design officer role is interesting in many ways. It's both kind of alludes a bit to the idea of our, I think in the policy sphere, we have the design competence and the designers, but it's also so many other people that are important and competences. And we'll talk about that in the next session about the skills and competence needed. So what are then the competence needed for a chief design officer? Who would that be, a designer, or should that kind of, it leads also to the idea of the history we have of the designers in an ivory tower. I can't, for me, it still had that kind of connotation that we have someone that knows the best, but we still need someone, the management, the manager, the leadership is so important to put the question and the competence, drive that forward. So I'm a bit mixed there. As you see, as you said, these positions on the city level has come and disappeared, and it would be really interesting to know a little bit more about why they have also disappeared over time.
Yeah.
And in one of our propositions we had, or in one, yes, of the proposition we had when we worked with the public inquiry in Sweden, was to construct some sorts of lab, but in another kind of structure. And it also, one of the discussions that was around that that became very political was who will lead this unit, who will make the decisions and take of what questions that would be taken into this kind of space, and who decides what actors should be further involved, etc. So that is also a very powerful position, depending on the job description, of course, of the chief design officer. But since design really becomes part of a decision material in another way when it comes close to policy, because decisions are made throughout the process that in another process would be made on in other democratic processes. So I think that's also an interesting tension, not least for the second question there, how we can advance design for policy and that agenda in government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, perhaps a chief design officer, has to align more towards, the political priorities, of a particular city or municipality. Whereas I think, I don't know, this is just hypothetical, whether perhaps a lab can be a little bit more agnostic in its approach to politics. And that's one of the questions I think in the chat. I would certainly say that there's no kind of template for labs, and that they all have a very different flavor when you start to look at them. There's no sort of off-the-shelf blueprint you can use to set up a lab. I think that the regional context is absolutely is vital for setting up these labs.
I'm also reading in the chat now going back to the CDO, I see Stefan's questions or maybe reflection of how the CDO, potential CDO would relate maybe to different type of governmental units or hierarchies. So kind of not necessarily a city, but then again, we're a little bit more into sectorial thinking, that there would be kind of more of certain governmental agendas, national agencies, for example, should they have their CDO? That I think would be interesting, Rod, because often they have like change, directors of change management, etc., etc. So then the step is not very far to have a chief design officer.
Yeah.
But how we can advance the design for policy agenda in government, I think that's also a tricky one and really interesting one.
Yeah. We're sort of starting to stray into the next session about skills, and there's a really great question about a chief design officer being fully qualified in design, leadership, strategy, and I completely agree. It's such a big ask, and that's what we're coming onto next.
But then we thought this has gone really smoothly, I think, so far. But we would also like to maybe, if there is, we've been going for 45 minutes. If you would like a short break, just like a 5-minute break, to maybe get a cup of coffee or just leave the screen, or if you'd like to join in to a few breakouts, that's optional to do so, to just kind of discuss around these themes. And they are themed in terms of more general policy and design, policy labs, policy design trends, and then a skills group. So if you want to join and chat or meet up with people in those, I guess Anna and I might just hang around here in the main room as well, and I'll see you back in 5 minutes.
Yep.
I think the breakout rooms are closed now and everybody is back in the session, so you can please keep on.
Yeah.
Perfect. So that kind of is a good transition then to the rise of the policy designer. So Anna.
Yeah, great. If you could click on to the next slide, please. So what's interesting is that, as I said, policy designer is now an official job title in UK government. We've had service designers for many years, and there are about 4,000 service designers working in UK government, mostly in the government digital service. So as part of our big digital government, digital public service transformation agenda. But there are a growing number of policy designers, and as I said, even one speculative designer. But what I'm really fascinated about is where these skills have come from. So I've also looked at UK universities and what they are teaching. And what's interesting is that service design is increasingly part of masters and even undergraduate degrees in the UK. And sometimes that strays into, talking about policy in a sort of broad sense, but there is nowhere that is, has a dedicated module as part of a master's degree in design for policy. But I think that will change, and I wouldn't be surprised if within a year or maybe two, that some UK universities have design for policy as a module within a master's for service design or design for public sector. There's a lot of doctoral research going on in design for policy. So So there's nobody teaching design for policy in UK universities. So if you wanted to click onto the next slide. So that raises the question of, so all these policy designers in government, how have they been trained? So what's interesting is that I've looked at both where students who studied service design, where they go after they finish their degrees, and also what the background is of policy designers who've taken up these policy design roles in government. And what's interesting is that very often the students who are graduating from universities, they go into a whole range of different roles, as you might expect. Some are policy roles, but some are sort of tend to be public service and digital roles in government. Sometimes it's corporate consulting. Sometimes it's academia. Sometimes it's working with creative industries or just being freelance. What I'm finding really fascinating, though, is that the people taking up the jobs of policy designers in government, very few of them actually have a professional background in design. So they are, there's not a criticism in any way, shape or form. It's just an observation. It's something that I find interesting. They are, for example, ethnographers, anthropologists, sociologists, behavioral scientists, psychologists, and then some designers. And this is something I want to come on to about, well, what is the skill set of a policy designer? So if you click onto the next slide, please. So I looked at, I looked at a number of job descriptions for recent policy designers in UK government, and the skills of a policy designer tend to fall into three kind of subsets. So practical skills, knowledge, and mindset. So practical skills such as producing high quality written evidence, being able to facilitate focus groups with citizens, being able to visualize complex data, creating and testing policy prototypes. Those are some of the examples. And then this is what I find fascinating is the knowledge, and this alludes to the question that someone put in the chat earlier, the knowledge that's required. You need to have knowledge of design, data, digital, policy development and delivery, user research, and how to align user research and policy intent for delivery. I mean, this is a big ask. And I think this is something that I find really fascinating because I think very often people who are policy designers fall into two categories. Either they have a professional background in policy, but they've learned about design, but they're not professional designers. Or they have a professional background in design and have learned about policy. But I think in the future, there might be some sort of hybrid where you can have a working knowledge of both. So it's very interesting because I think there's a question around how much can you really build design and knowledge among a civil servant who's come from a background in a completely different context. I think this is where design thinking comes in. I'm a firm believer in design thinking. I think lots of people slate design thinking, but I actually think it's fantastic to be able to give people who don't have a background in design a working knowledge so they can work effectively with designers, commission design, write a design brief, manage a design project, etc. So I think this is all about trying to build awareness and capability of design. So I'm always really fascinated by people who do policy design in government, whether they are in fact from a design background or if they're from a policy background and learned about design. So you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm really curious to find out, what the situation is in Sweden. So what are the skills of a policy designer? And also, how can we create a community of practice around policy design? And that might be, at a regional, national or international level.
And I think I haven't done there's no study being done in the same way over the Swedish policy designers, similar to one you have done in the UK, but my experience would be very similar to yours, that they're either designers that have entered into the governmental space and then acquired policy awareness, knowledge and skills throughout that process, or vice versa, that there are people with the policy formed education within public management or similar that have acquired design skills or knowledge at various degrees throughout, being part of design projects, doing some kind of training, etc. So, but they still have their major competence and knowledge base in one or the two. I'm not so surprised to see that the skills that you say that what people come from that works with design, like anthropology, sociology, since also design draw a lot of that, particularly in this kind of space, draws a lot on ethnography, anthropology, sociology is part of the knowledge base for our then design interpretations of the same. But I was, have you seen, and I would say that on the educational basis, it's very similar. But we are a smaller country, less population to have a broad set of educationals and master's degrees, but we have a few master's degrees that are formulated in the direction of service design. Not one on our artistically based design schools. Then they are more broader design, where service design can be part of the curricula, but it's not specific service design framed. And we don't have any with a specific policy direction. But I also would like to ask you about, do you see that the educationals that are directed towards the policy realm, it starts to integrate designed courses within the curricula? Because that would also be the other way around. So how is design knowledge infusing the curricula of more traditional policy educations, would probably be the question.
Absolutely. And I think what's also interesting is that policy labs are really trying to influence the continuous professional development modules that civil servants have to take on a regular basis, and to infuse design within those courses. So it's not necessarily about making all civil servants, design thinkers, but actually just so that they are aware of these kind of approaches and where they can add value to different parts of the policy process.
Oh, I had something in my mind that but it popped out for the moment. We have seen during the past maybe 5-6 years more of a self-organizing networks coming up, not least around our national agencies that start to just say, regarding the community of practice, to kind of say, I'm so alone in my position. I'm here as a designer, UX, whatever, even in digital in my national agency, I'm one or we are two, but we have no community of practice in our specific environment. So where do we meet? So there are at least one or a couple self-organized networks which try to share experience, best practices, also directions, etc. So I think that's an interesting, also the development, the need of having support in your position, because also feeling that you're kind of another type of knowledge that are introduced in a more dominant sphere.
Yeah. There's some really fascinating stuff going on in the chat, and it's like trying to be drawn between the two. But I think it's absolutely right. I also think designers can be very naive, and this is again drawing on our friend and foe. I think designers can be very naive about the constraints of policy, and actually this is something that is really, really important, that we should be certainly educating designers in public governance and public processes, because I genuinely think that designers have a huge amount to offer, huge amount of value to offer public sector processes, whether it's policy or digital public services or whatever. But I think sometimes designers underestimate the complexity of the environment in which policymakers operate.
And I also find it interesting that we come from, we often talk about the different knowledge base of designers also coming from another epistemological basis, but we are also trained as finding change or possibilities of change or renewal in everything we see, whereas public servants are trained more to stay put, to keep it as is, because that also now I feel like lack vocabulary, but the role is to persist in stability for the citizens, to say, this is what the promise is, we will deliver this, it has to be stable, from the same from one to another, or we have to be there for you. So the mind shift to start to continuously think about how could this be better, how can we improve. This continuous ongoing change mindset that is very much within both the design education and probably together with the people that apply or are interested in designerly approaches. So you really have to find the fit, because you also have those more forward-oriented bureaucrats in the system. So finding the right people here, because it's not, everything is not for everybody. So how to find that fit and also balance that and understand that from a designerly position too, that you can't change everything at once. We have to have a kind of big amount of stability in this system as well. I think can be a change, and connecting to the naiveness sometimes that design might enter into. Should we pick something from the chat here? What's happening? It's such a, can you pick something, or Jonas or Kalle, can you see something that you can pick up?
There's a really great question around design and democracy. And this is, again, I think this question is a little bit above my pay grade, but I find this topic really fascinating. There's a really good point around the fact that non-democratic governments also have established these design capabilities, including the UAE. I was really lucky this week. I spoke to a cohort of civil servants in Uzbekistan about what the role of more user-centered processes could be in their policy processes. And of course, there is a completely different cultural context there. I think even there was a suggestion that having a female presenter wasn't even necessarily something they would usually have in a very kind of formalized environment. So I'm really fascinated about what design can add, where design can add value to these kind of alternative models of governance. And I don't have an answer to it, but it's just something that I find very fascinating.
I think some of the questions in the chat is about the same thing, and that is it preferable to teach or train the management, those people who's in management and strategy and policies with design, and make them the chief design officers, or the other way around, to teach the designers in strategy, policy, and management skills, which is more preferable?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. It's sort of chicken and egg question, isn't it, really? I think that I would say that a professionally trained designer can really be a breath of fresh air to government machinery, which is sometimes very traditional. And I think that either is fine, either would be great. But I do think that professionally trained designers have, a certain skill set that just does not exist in government. And if you really want to introduce innovation in government, then you need to introduce people with those completely different skill sets. And I think that designers are one of a number of those different innovation skill sets. What do you think, Katarina?
I agree, of course. But I also see that we have been working now for quite some years to address, and I think also the question about the difference between educating or training management. I think that was embedded in that question, to kind of become more knowledgeable or comfortable, at least, with design and design approaches, to be able to open up and allow them to be there. I think at some point in the first stage, if you don't have those nesters that actually cater for design to happen, you have to find ways for the system or manager to at least tolerate design to be there until it starts to show why it's there. So it's not even to get that super engagement. Sometimes you see the people that get that flip. It's like, wow, now I get it. We need to have this. We need to infuse our system with this, and everybody. But not everybody gets that, of various reasons, and you might not have to have that. So so when you have that more lukewarm, warm environment, how do you still get the managers and leaders to engage and support? And is training a good way, or is partaking in projects another? I don't know. How have you worked with that kind of processes?
Yeah, I definitely think that design is one of those things you have to experience to understand what the added value is. But the problem is, as you put it, is how do you get in the door in the first place to speak to let's call them a non-believer, or somebody who hasn't necessarily engaged with design before? And this is one of the challenges with design, is design can't necessarily be evaluated in the same way as other methods, because where design adds value is perhaps less tangible. And I think this is still a stumbling block for design and policy is, where does it, I do not doubt that design adds value, but actually quantifying how it adds value. And, for example, through randomized control trials, if you had an expert in randomized control trials, it'd be really fascinating to see, how a design approach could add value. But Sabina, you look like you want to jump in on this.
We have like 4 minutes left of our session.
Yes,
so
I'll make it
short.
short. Yeah, I'll make it short,
Yes.
because I think it's really an important question, and somebody in the chat just wrote exactly what I was going to say. Is it really an either or, and a question? And this I fear that Anna, I mean, I appreciate so much. All of you have done a really fantastic job with the way that you presented this work and what you're working on. But aren't we in danger of continuing this two tribes at war story? Us designers, they policymakers, they public managers. And isn't it really in 21 time to kind of like overcome that, and rather to see where we're in this together? And this is what I think Katarina said, that it's not, my understanding is we cannot expect innovation labs or little tiny innovation groups or one or two chief designers to change the system. It has to be a comprehensive approach. And in order for that to happen, we need to allow that actually some policymakers are designers, and maybe not all of them, but the others may just exactly what you said, I think, Katarina, generate or create an understanding for things that then you don't have to train them in the organization. I mean, our research shows that we are in a Sisyphus situation in organization, it doesn't matter public or private, where we constantly try to retrain people with new things, and then they leave and they go and you come in and we train them again and train them again. That's not the answer. We have to have it systemic. So sorry, that's all I wanted to add to that. And please, that's
Thank you,
really
Sabina.
in an either or situation?
No, but I agree. It's not an either or, it's both. And all forces joined here, both professional designers and of course professional policymakers, say, if you have that ground knowledge in that, but also the merge. And we need to get that entered both in the educational system on both sides, I think, both in the policy educational system and in the design system as well. So we get that from the beginning, because it's so difficult to change mindset and your ways of thinking when you're further on in your career. I mean, shoot, time goes quickly, Anna. We've been here for 1 hour and 15 minutes and we have 2 more to go. What do you want to send to? Fantastic questions. We'll get back to that. But Anna, last words.
Just to say, Sabina, I completely agree. And I think it'd be fantastic if we could, what I love is integrating design challenges into early childhood. And I think that is something that's really important. If you get children working on design challenges, multidisciplinary teams, you don't necessarily call it design, you call it whatever you want to, but getting children into this mindset of, creative problem solving, I think actually that would go a long way towards overcoming a lot of these barriers. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting space. I love talking about this. I could talk about it a lot longer. So yeah, I look forward to continuing the dialogue in other ways.
Yes, thank you so much for your time and brilliant discussion here. Thank you so much.